On the night Dennis Brown's lungs finally gave up in Kingston's University Hospital, his voice was still pouring out of cheap speakers all over the city, in minibuses grinding up Halfway Tree Road, on a corner sound system in Spanish Town, in a bar where a flickering TV in the corner silently scrolled the words, "Reggae star critically ill." The same tenor that had once been crowned the Prince of Reggae floated over plastic tables and warm beer. In the ward, the air smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and the faint trace of rain blown in through high windows. There were no stage lights, no clouds of ganja smoke, no cheering crowd, just the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the sigh of an oxygen machine, the soft shuffle of nurses moving around a body that had spent 3 decades on stage, convincing strangers that love would always find a way. Outside, a bass line from Money in My Pocket made a zinc fence rattle. Inside, a doctor pressed a stethoscope to a chest that millions of people only ever thought of as a voice and listened in vain for lungs that could no longer keep the rhythm. Reggae was supposed to be the music of survival, the hymn book of people who refused to disappear. So when its crown prince dies at 42 from a collapsed lung and a tired heart, while his voice keeps working overtime on every corner of the island, the question hangs in the fluorescent light: whose survival were we really cheering for all those years, before he was royalty to anyone? Dennis Emmanuel Brown was just another boy in a packed Kingston yard, born in 1957 inches Jubilee Hospital and raised in the narrow streets between North Street and King Street. His father, Arthur, wrote radio plays and did small acting jobs, which meant words and stories were part of the house, but not money. The yard was the real education. Neighbors shouting, radios fighting each other from open windows, children weaving through wash lines and buckets. In that constant noise, the one way to be heard was to be extraordinary. Dennis learned early that if he sang just right, the noise rearranged itself. Men at the domino table stopped slamming pieces. Women at the standpipe turned their heads. Little kids went quiet. Before any producer ever heard him, he already understood power. One small body, one oversized voice, whole yard under a spell. Music, at first, was not a career but a survival trick. After his mother died in the 1960 seconds, the household got even more chaotic. Grief has a way of turning up the volume on everything. Dennis escaped the only way he knew how. He copied Sam Cooke and Nat King Cole from the radio, mimicking phrasing he barely understood, letting melodies do what food and sleep often could not calm the system down. Neighbors started calling him when they had visitors. Sing a tune for we, Dennis. They pressed coins into his hand afterwards. Not much, but enough to teach a dangerous lesson. This voice could pay bills. At 9, the school put a microphone in his hand for an end-of-term concert. There is always a first room in stories like this, the place where someone who is supposed to be ordinary reveals they are not. For Dennis, that room was a hot, echoing school hall with a squealing PA, a borrowed shirt and 2 big shoes. He opened his mouth, and what came out didn't sound like a child trying on a song for fun. It sounded like a grown man who had already survived things, pouring experience into borrowed lyrics. Teachers exchanged looks over the heads of their students. Later, they would say, "We knew then." Dennis just knew that. For a few minutes, the world had stopped yelling. By 11, the stage was no longer a school hall. His older brother was doing comedy slots with a band called the Fabulous Falcons, and one night they let little Dennis come up between songs. He sang a ballad about heartbreak he had never actually lived through, and grown adults responded the way they had responded in the yard. They threw money, but this time it was more than pennies. He walked off stage with his pockets full and his head spinning. The applause was intoxicating, but the money was practical. He used it to buy his first proper suit, the kind he saw on American singers on imported record sleeves. It was half costume, half armor fabric, proof that this boy, in this very poor city, had stumbled onto something that could change the terms of his life. Very quickly, people with more power than a yard full of neighbors noticed. In Orange Street's JJ's record shop, where imported vinyl and local singles were stacked in precarious towers, the boy who should have been in class started spending whole days. The shop was an unofficial audition room. Singers came and went. Producers popped in. The latest Studio One or Treasure Isle sides battled for attention on the turntable behind the counter. Dennis watched and listened. He learned that there was a difference between singing well and singing the way the microphone liked, the way the groove needed. When Clement Coxone Dodd finally brought him into Studio One, it wasn't by accident. The kid had been haunting the edges of the business long enough that it felt inevitable. Studio One was church and factory at once. The band ran the rhythm in one small, airless room while singers waited in another, hoping their turn would come before inspiration ran out. When Dennis stepped into the vocal booth to cut No Man is an Island, he was 12. With a head barely high enough to see over some of the equipment, the headphones were too big. The lyric was a meditation on loneliness and interdependence that made more sense in the mouth of a middle-aged man. But when he sang it, something uncanny happened. The thin boy's body stayed in the booth. A much older soul seemed to lean into the microphone. The tape rolled, the track went to acetate, and within a year, Jamaica was singing along to a child sounding like an oracle. The phrase "boy wonder" followed him from that moment like a shadow. Success, in that version of the music business, didn't mean rest. It meant more sessions. Once Studio One had proved he could sell records, other producers wanted their own Dennis Brown sides. He cut singles for Derek Harriott, for Niney the Observer, for Joe Gibbs. He recorded so much, so fast, that discographies still argue over exactly how many albums he made. Tracks were repackaged, retitled and resold under different covers in different markets. For the teenage Dennis, there was no time to untangle rights and royalties. Someone called. There was a session. He showed up. He sang. He got a fee. He went home tired and a little more famous. Adults around him made long-term decisions off his short-term labor. In the early 1970 seconds, Jamaica itself was changing key. Independence was less than a decade old. The optimism of the early years had given way to hard economics and harder politics. Parties armed ghettos, and lines were being drawn in concrete and blood. Sound systems, massive stacks of speakers set up on street corners and in dance halls were both escape and amplifier. They blasted American soul and homegrown reggae into the night until the whole city felt like it pulsed at 4/4. Dennis's voice became one of the standard fixtures in that sonic landscape. You could walk from one end of downtown to the other on a Friday night and hear him over and over, his tenor sliding over different rhythms, promising love, warning about wolves, calling on Jah. What made him unique was not just the number of songs, but the split personality of his catalog. On one side were the love songs, the tracks that would later fill Lovers Rock compilations. Love Has Found Its Way, How Could I Leave, Should I? They carried a gentleness that felt like a hand on your shoulder in a rough room. On the other side were the roots, tunes, repatriation, revolution. What about the half? In those, the same voice turned flinty, singing about injustice, inequality, the spiritual mission of Rastafari. Dennis could step out of a studio where he had spent an hour telling a woman she was his everything, and into another where he warned corrupt leaders that judgment was coming. The contradiction lived inside him easily. The world outside, which wanted clean marketing categories, struggled more. He was still a teenager when Money in My Pocket became his passport. In Jamaica, it was already a hit. In Britain, the extended Disc Comics version Vocal plus DJ Toast caught fire in West Indian communities and then bled into the pop charts. The boy from North Street found himself in London, on stages in Brixton and Birmingham, singing to rooms full of people who looked like his cousins but carried British passports. They had grown up on grey council estates, listening to reggae through thin walls, while their parents worked night shifts or cleaned other people's offices. For them, Dennis wasn't just a singer. He was a line of direct connection back to a place they had heard about in stories and summer trips. Reviewers noted how young he looked, how mature he sounded. Promoters noticed something else. With his work ethic and catalog, you could put his name on virtually any bill and guarantee a crowd. That guarantee became its own trap. Dennis and producer Winston "Ninety" Holness tried to turn his success into leverage by starting DEB Music, their own label. The idea was simple and revolutionary. Own the masters, control the releases, stop letting other people slice up and resell his work. In practice, it meant long nights in small offices above London shops, wrangling with distributors, chasing unpaid invoices, borrowing against future tours to press current records. At the same time, back in Jamaica, the violence was escalating. The 1978 One Love Peace concert was billed as a turning point, a moment when music might calm a country on the brink. Bob Marley famously joined the hands of rival political leaders on stage. Elsewhere on the bill, Dennis sang his own set to a stadium full of people who wanted entertainment and salvation at the same time. He gave them what they wanted as best he could, but nothing in his childhood yard had prepared him for the feeling of standing in front of 30,000 people, while snipers sat in surrounding hills. He had been carrying too much for too long. In 1973, before some of these triumphs, he had already collapsed from exhaustion. The rumors that spread afterward: tuberculosis, one lung, only weeks to live, say as much about Jamaica's appetite for myth as they do about his actual medical chart. What is true is simple and stark. He had worked himself to a point where his body refused to continue without a pause. Doctors told him to slow down, focus on school, let his voice rest. For a short stretch, he did, but the phone kept ringing. Producers kept offering sessions. Promoters kept offering shows. Family needed money. Old patterns reasserted themselves. A boy who had learned at 11 that his voice could pay the bills was not built to say no when the bills arrived. The 1980 seconds brought another change of rhythm that had nothing to do with his lungs and everything to do with technology. Digital drum machines and cheap synthesizers arrived in Kingston. The lush horn and string arrangements that had been Dennis Brown's natural environment suddenly sounded expensive and old-fashioned to some ears. New stars rode bare, skeletal rhythms that left no room for orchestras. For many of his generation, the shift was a threat. For Dennis, ever adaptable, it was also an invitation. He voiced tracks for producers like Prince Jammy and Gussie Clarke, over stripped-down, digital backings, his warm tenor softening the machine edges, big all round, and sitting and watching, showed that he could ride a computerized rhythm with the same authority he had brought to live bands. At the same time, he signed with A&M in an attempt to cross fully into the American market. The albums he cut for them smoothed some of the rawness of his Jamaican work, layering in keyboards and backing vocals aimed at R&B radio. To some fans, this was a betrayal. To Dennis, it was survival. The Jamaican industry alone had never made him rich. London tours paid bills, but British labels folded. Owing money, a major label deal looked like a chance to finally get paid at the level his output deserved. The reality was more complicated. The records underperformed in the States. The label's enthusiasm cooled. And amidst the constant motion between studios, countries, and styles, a quieter, more intimate enemy was tightening its grip. Cocaine did not announce itself with a dramatic entrance in Dennis Brown's life. It was simply there, in the dressing rooms of clubs, in the after-parties in small London flats, in the studios where night sessions blurred into early mornings. For an artist who had been performing since childhood, the drug's promises were brutally efficient. Need to push through fatigue for one more take. Need to be charming at one more meet and greet after a show when you really want to lie down. Need to banish the creeping thought that your best work might already be behind you. A line on a mirror offered, at least temporarily. An answer. What cocaine never offers is a way out. Friends and collaborators later talked, haltingly, about the way his relationship with the drug evolved. From occasional indulgence to regular companion to invisible boss, they tell stories of sessions where Dennis arrived late, eyes red, still somehow capable of delivering a take that raised the hairs on everyone's arms. They also tell stories of sessions that never happened, shows that were canceled, opportunities that evaporated because he simply could not make himself appear. In a cruel twist, some of the records from this period are among his most emotionally intense. To a listener, the slight rasp in his voice sounds like extra soul. To the people in the room, it sounded like strain. Gregory Isaacs was walking a parallel path. The two men embodied a certain idea of Jamaican masculinity in music. Seductive but sensitive, strong but not afraid of tenderness. They both ended up in the same crack houses and police blotters. The crown prince of reggae and the cool ruler, men who had provided the soundtrack for thousands of romances, increasingly struggled to maintain steady relationships in their own lives. The same cultures, street, studio, industry that celebrated their output had very few tools to help them deal with addiction beyond shame, jokes, and the occasional stay in a rehab center that felt more like exile than treatment. Meanwhile, the workload never really diminished. Dennis's discography in the 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds reads like the schedule of someone being slowly eaten alive by his own productivity. Album after album for different labels, collaboration after collaboration, live album, compilation, commourned all the mations, compilation, one-off single voiced on this or that popular rhythm. Some of this was pure creative hunger. Much of it was economics. When you live in a city without a safety net, you become your own social security system. A man with 13 children does not retire. He works until something stops him. That something arrived in stages, wearing the names of ordinary illnesses that become deadly in worn-out bodies. Asthma, chest infections, finally pneumonia. In early 1999, after a tour of Brazil, Dennis came down with what at first looked like a bad flu. He was 42, one hobby disgrade, 7 deeded. An age when many musicians in richer countries are releasing box sets and playing tasteful reunion tours. He checked into Kingston's University Hospital as a patient, but the staff knew who he was. The nurses humming along to his songs at the nurses' station understood the irony more keenly than any music journalist. The man whose records had, for decades, made sick rooms feel less lonely was now in one, struggling to breathe. Pneumonia in a healthy person is serious but often survivable. Pneumonia in lungs that have spent years inhaling smoke and cheap stage fog, lungs strained by cocaine and constant touring, is something else, over days. His condition worsened. Fluid and infection made each breath a negotiation. On June 30th, his heart stopped. Doctors revived him, but the reprieve was brief. On July 1st, 1999, Dennis Brown died of cardiac arrest following a collapsed lung. Official reports mentioned cocaine as a factor. Unofficially, everyone who loved reggae knew that this was not a story about one bad habit. It was the endpoint of a long equation that had started with a boy in a yard realizing he could feed a family with his throat. The funeral a few weeks later tried to resolve that equation with pomp. Kingston turned out in force. The service lasted 3 hours. Fans stood outside in sun and sudden rain, pressed against fences, listening to muffled hymns and testimonies through speakers that distorted at the edges. Inside, politicians who had once hired Dennis to sing at rallies now took the podium to praise his contribution to national culture. The current Prime Minister spoke, a former prime minister, spoke. Singers from the generation after his, Maxi Priest, Shaggy, and others performed his songs in voices that, for all their power, could not quite reproduce the particular ache in his phrasing. When the time came to lower his coffin, it was into National Heroes Park, the resting place of leaders of the independence movement, prime ministers, soldiers. Burying a singer there was both a radical act and an easy gesture. It said, your voice mattered as much as theirs. It also risked doing what all monuments do, freezing a complicated, exhausted human being into a tidy symbol that demands admiration, but not responsibility. Back in the everyday Jamaica he had sung for, life went on. Minibus drivers still loaded passengers and turned up the sound systems. On some afternoons, love has found its way, drifted out of tinny speakers, while conductors shouted for fares. In London, in a terraced house in Tottenham, a second-generation British-Jamaican mother stirred a pot of rice and peas while her old Dennis Brown LP, slightly warped, turned on a cheap turntable in the corner. In a Bronx apartment, a young dancehall artist built a new track on a sampled snatch of his voice, pitching it, looping it, turning someone else's heartbreak into their own breakthrough. The Crown Prince was dead, but his labor had been sliced into so many pieces, pressed onto so many discs, encoded into so many files, that his presence felt as common and persistent as streetlight. This is the strange cruelty at the heart of Dennis Brown's story. As his physical body shrank and failed, his recorded body multiplied. He became, in a very real sense, more ubiquitous in death than he had been in life. People who never saw him on stage know his cadences by heart. Couples who have never read his name on a concert poster have conceived children to his love songs. Activists and sufferers still quote his roots lyrics. The man whose lungs gave out at 42 is still doing the one thing he did from 9 years old, holding rooms together with his voice. Only now those rooms rarely remember to ask what that job cost him. Long before that last hospital stay, you could see little glimpses of where the road was leading if you knew how to look. In backstage corridors after shows, fans pressed in on him, hands on his shoulders, on his chest, wanting to get close to the man whose records had narrated their first kisses, their breakups, their reconciliations. He gave out hugs easily, signed whatever was pushed in front of him, cracked jokes to keep the mood light. Then, the dressing room door would finally close, and, for a few minutes, the smile would drop. Band members remember him sitting very still, head bowed, as if trying to gather the pieces of himself he had just handed out. 10 minutes later, he would haul himself up, straighten his shirt, and walk back out into the night, because there was always one more obligation: a radio drop, a visit to a promoter's house, a call from someone who just needed a dub plate. Quick, piece by piece, the job of being Dennis Brown ate into the time available to be Dennis Brown. The person, touring, magnified the split. In Britain, he stayed in modest hotels on the outskirts of towns whose names blurred together. Leeds, Luton, Leicester, places where Caribbean immigrants had carved out small enclaves of home in the middle of red brick England. By day, he did press interviews in cold, overlit studios, answering the same questions about the reggae boom and political violence back home in a soft, careful voice that gave as little away as possible. By night, he walked onto stages, saturated with ganja smoke and condensation, greeted by audiences who had been drinking and waiting for hours, ready to pour their longing into whichever song he chose to sing first. Sometimes he leaned into the Roots catalog, giving them fire and prophecy. Other nights, he chose the love songs, knowing that in those cramped rooms, a promise that love would find its way meant more than any campaign speech. It was, in its own way, a kind of ministry. But ministers have congregations who are taught to care for them in return. Crowds have only appetite, even at home, where the myth says reggae stars are kings in their own right. The reality was more complicated. In Kingston, fame did not insulate you from brown water in the taps, from power cuts, from the low-grade fear that comes with living in a city where young men settle arguments with guns. When the electricity went, as it often did, the refrigerator in Dennis's house went warm just like everyone else's on the block. When a brethren got shot, he went to the wakes and funerals, not as a distant celebrity, but as another man in a crumpled suit trying to make sense of how quickly life disappeared. These ordinary indignities mattered because they meant that, even as his records traveled the world, he remained physically inside the same pressure cooker that had produced them. There was nowhere to retreat to that was quiet enough, for long enough, for his lungs and his nerves to truly recover. There is an easy way to tell this story, and it is the way industries prefer. Genius, rise, excess, fall. A cautionary tale where the moral is that he should have taken better care of himself, as if self-care were a simple matter in a life structured around everyone else's demands. There is another way. For me, end quote. Less comfortable and more honest. In that version, Dennis Brown is not a tragic exception. He is a case study in what happens when a poor, gifted child is plugged into a machine that has no off switch. From his first records at Studio One, other people's rent and car payments and school fees depended on the songs he could deliver on command. Every time a label went bankrupt owing him money, someone else got paid first. Every time he pulled an all-nighter to finish an album on schedule, a marketing department somewhere stayed on track. Every time he walked out of a doctor's office with an inhaler and a warning to rest, there was another show booked that made rest sound like a selfish fantasy. Cocaine did not create that dynamic. It just helped him bear it until his body couldn't. None of this absolves him of responsibility for his choices. True tragedy is never that simple. Dennis Brown made decisions that hurt people around him. He missed commitments, disappointed collaborators, worried family. The point is not to canonize him as a martyr. The point is to widen the frame so that he is not the only one on trial. When a system is built on the assumption that certain bodies, black, working class, born in post-colonial ghettos, can be pushed to exhaustion and discarded at 42, it is worth asking who wrote that assumption into the contract. Today, when a young singer in Kingston or London steps up to a cheap studio microphone and their voice makes everyone in the room straighten up, there is always a scramble to do something with that gift. Managers appear, producers promise development, friends talk about visas and tours. It is very easy, in that first rush, to dream only in records and stage lights. Harder to imagine hospital wards, or children standing at a graveside, listening to strangers weep louder than they do. Harder to say, if we build a career on this person's voice, how do we also build a life that their body can survive? Dennis Brown left behind more than 70 albums, 13 children, and a line in history books that calls him the Crown Prince of Reggae. He also left behind an unanswered question, one that hangs over every sound system that still drops. Love has found its way. At 2 in the morning, if reggae is truly the music of the oppressed, the soundtrack of endurance, then what does it mean that one of its brightest voices died worn out and undercared for while his records played on? Are we content to keep borrowing the comfort in that tenor, to keep filling our rooms with his promises that love will find a way, without ever offering to the next Dennis Brown the one thing his lungs never got enough of room to rest, and the kind of steady, unglamorous care that turns survival from a slogan into a reality?